I'll start by giving an overview of the model I built in 1996, which makes this model 20 years old now. On the canopy rail I put Colonel Ron L. Kurth, who was the commander of the 162nd Fighter Wing when I first joined. He later became a brigadier general with the unit, but subsequently died of brain cancer. Here we have the yellow and pink ejection seat warning emblems. These later become different shades of gray during the career of the jet for ease of repaint and camouflage purposes. Looking closer at the cockpit, you can see the ejection seat oxygen bottle, the side stick controller for the flight controls, and the ejection seat handles, and also the radar display known as the Rio. As you can see, it's very crude in here. I didn't do a lot of detailed work. Very rudimentary. Looking at the upper fuselage, we have the air refuel door, which has scrapes and scratches, which you get during in-flight operations from the air refuel boom of a KC-10 or KC-135 tanker jet. You'll also notice I did the reference markings using paint and not decals. Looking lower, we have these fuel cell access panels, which would periodically ooze an oily substance. A crude outline would form around the panels and would be enhanced by dirt and dust mixed in with the escaped fuel. Going towards the tail of the aircraft, we see more fluid leaks and chipped paint. And here's the tail flash of the Arizona Air National Guard at that time. This is the Arizona state flag, a scripted Arizona, which later became an abbreviated large AZ, the Air National Guard emblem, which is much smaller these days, and the tail number 80527. If you're an F-16 expert, you know this is a cheat because this is a C model base and not an A model base, which 80527 was. And here's 80527 as it sits in the boneyard today. On the right side, you can see the decals have deteriorated quite considerably on the model. I should quickly note that the actual aircraft is slated to go into the Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, which is quite a coincidence. On the right side, here's the Sidewinder missile. On the underside, there's not a lot going on down here, just some paint chips, some scratches, some grease streaks, oil streaks, or hydraulic fluid streaks, but not a lot of attention to detail here. There's no shadowing effects. You can see that the landing gear bays are very clean, almost pristine white. No shadowing. You can even see the seam line here on the centerline fuel tank. So not a lot of attention to detail was emphasized. Here's the left main gear wheel, which shows brake soot and hydraulic fluid contamination. If you look at the leading edge flap, we have paint chipping down to the bare aluminum skin and some green coloring to simulate zinc chromate anti-corrosion paint. And here's a picture of me in 1996 with this very same model in front of me, and in back of me the actual jet 80527. Big plane, little plane. And here's the kit for the rebuild. It was sitting in my garage for over 13 years and was in its original cellophane wrap until I just opened it recently. During the new rebuild, I got quite frustrated with the seam line between the upper and lower fuselage, and I threw down the model. And as you can see, I broke it into several pieces. So this is an overview of a wreckage site, if you will. I've created a lot of extra work for myself here. A close-up view of this section shows I did some pre-shading work, shadowing, and filtering work before I broke the model. Here's the major sections. And here's a slightly different view. Let's put it back together again. I started by dry fitting the parts together to determine if I needed to make any adjustments. After that, I began to glue the sections back together again. Some parts I could hold together by hand, others I had to tape together. Closer look here, you'll see I actually have some fractures, not clean breaks in some places. To improve the repair, I used excess glue in the seams of the brakes, and I've also added pieces of plastic toothpicks in order to improve the structural integrity. I don't know if there's a better way to do this, but I just did this on the fly, so any comments are appreciated. The worst break of all was here at the cockpit, so it's going to be quite a bit of work to get this seamlessly put together again. You may be asking why I don't just get a new kit and avoid all this trouble, but unfortunately this is no longer in production. And here I've begun joining the cockpit back to the main fuselage. And this is the underside view, of course. Just adding more glue, trying to build up a kind of a weld here. Looking at the initial reconstruction, you can see it looks pretty bad. We're looking at a lot of work here to get it back into shape. The cockpit didn't come out too bad. There's not going to be a lot of work here, it looks like. Looking at the lower fuselage, you can see it's coming out much better. The seams are much closer together, not so visible, so just maybe a little sanding work here, not so much putty work. And here's another view after a little sanding. And here's an updated view of the two portions after I've done some initial sanding before putting some putty in. Before I continue, I want to mention that I am cannibalizing a vertical tail from this Hasegawa kit in order to make the new build more accurate. Here are the two tails from that kit. On the left is the C model tail, which has the upper UHF antenna at the very front of that base. And on the right is the A model vertical tail, which would have the UHF antenna inside the base. And as you can see, I've already done shadowing and put the Arizona state flag at the very top. Going back in time here, I'm showing a little work with the airbrush here, putting on the Arizona state flag. Wherever I can, I try to paint markings on a model rather than use a decal. To get my custom tail number, I've scanned the decal sheet along with other decal sheets, and I've used a Photoshop program to get the scripted Arizona off actual photographic images. I've made several duplicates on my master sheet in case I have any mistakes during the application process to the model. I'll be using the Expert's Choice decal sheet, which can be used on any computer printer. Okay, I'm going to start the part I've been dreading the most, which is doing the puttying and the sanding, which I think is the most horrible portion of doing any model. It's really tedious and really frustrating, I think, because I'm not a very good sculptor, as it were. You can see I'm using Tamiya putty. I've never used this one before, so it's brand new to me. I must say it comes out of the tube very nicely. It's very flows very easily, but it just in about 10 seconds it starts already kind of getting viscous and kind of hard to work with. So I think the recommendation is to thin it out a little with acetone, but I kind of worry about acetone because that might help, or not help, but melt the model. I continue to attend to the areas where I made the breaks. I'm not too worried about the panel lines right now. I'm going to have to rescribe a lot of things and try to get it back up to speed and not so noticeable once it's painted. Here I'm using very light acetone here to kind of spread out the putty. By making it even, I hope to reduce the amount of sanding work I have to do, of course. And here I just continue to work each of the break points, thinning it all out. Here we go to the bottom portion. It's already dried here, and I've begun sanding. This bottom fuselage was much easier to do than the top fuselage. Here I've lightly painted black paint over those brake lines to see if I'm matching up very well. And here I'm back where I started before I broke the model construction-wise. This is where I was at the point of breaking the model, but I'm behind in painting, as you can tell, because I have to repaint everything. And here I'm spraying flat white paint to kind of bring out the highlighted areas again, so once I do the pre-shading and the final coat, that we get those variations in paint tones to simulate weathering and normal fading while these jets are out on the flight line getting sun bleached. And here I've begun the pre-shading portion, just following any panel lines that I can find to make those highlight. It looks pretty sloppy when you first start, and it's kind of aggravating. You feel like you're making a mess. But once you start getting that base coat on, you can adjust the levels of the pre-shading, so it comes out better. And of course, as we know, weathering is not even and nice and neat. It's kind of sloppy, and there's all those variations. I think this comes out much better on Navy aircraft that people model, because you get the sea air with all the salt and causes all the corrosion, so you get a lot of variations in the grays and colors of jets on an aircraft carrier. And here I'm on the upper fuselage, again following any panel lines that I can find, any raised portions, any areas where I think it might be a little darker due to shadowing. Kind of simulate a larger scale plane than it actually is. And there were a lot more panel lines here on the upper portion, so this takes much longer, and as you can see, I'm getting lots and lots of different lines. And actually, it looks like a junkyard plane right here. I mean, a plane you would see out in a boneyard, being untended to for years. But of course, once we get that base coat on, it's going to look a lot more realistic and like an active duty plane. And here I'm working on the wing again. I'm basically starting over again on the painting. My pre-shade lines are dry now on the lower fuselage, so now I begin putting on the base coat, which is the sky gray. I'm exercising a lot of control here. So the mist is very light and very narrow, and it's actually taking longer than most people probably would do. But I don't want to have to go over this again, so I'm just being very methodical, trying to get those lines exactly the shade I want. I don't want them too overpowering and noticeable. They should be more of a subtle effect, I think. I'm kind of lazy about paint color, so I try to use paint straight out of the bottle without having to mix my own custom colors. Even though this video portion is speeded up, you can see it took some time to complete the lower fuselage, just trying to make the shading and the filtering match to the variation I want and try to get that realistic effect. Again, I'm using very small amounts of paint with each pass, so the buildup is very slow, but it's more controllable, and I won't have to go over this again. Getting a little anxious to complete this model. I don't know why. You're supposed to take your time with these kind of things, otherwise you just get a poor result, of course. Here I'm working towards the rear near the engine nozzle, and I can remember working on these jets and there was always hydraulic fluid dripping around this area. A little fuel too, and of course when the jet just came back from a flight, it would be very hot, and I just hated working around the engine, just sticking your hands around any compartments around that engine. It was very hot, constantly burning your knuckles. It can be frustrating sometimes when you're trying to do your work. And we're just about finished with the lower fuselage here, and we'll work on detailing panel lines later after we gloss coat it. And just getting the wings. These are the undersides of the wings, of course. Trying to filter out those pre-shade lines, and of course, if you notice this area towards the root of the wing, I had those sanding lines, like on this portion that I'm doing right here. Get that back up to speed as far as the tone and the base coat of the wing. Okay, we're starting on the upper fuselage now, and I start with the right horizontal stabilizer. I'm trying to keep that bleached look at the center of the stabilizer here because I remember that being very prone to sun bleaching while it was out on the flight line. And so that was probably one of the most noticeable areas of variation in tone. Now I'm just going along the entire upper fuselage, trying to get a subtle effect again with the pre-shading lines. It really sucked working up on the hump, as I called it, on the upper part of this jet. It was very slippery up here, and your feet would always want to slide right from out under you. And I've had a couple of colleagues that had fallen right off the airplane because of this. They would just slide right off. And I had another colleague, somebody dropped the ratchet, and it slid down like a slide here. And another guy on the ground turned around, and the ratchet hit him right in the face. So you heard this thunk, thunk, and a smack. Of course, we were all laughing, but he wasn't too amused by it. But you get all those funny stories when you're working on these kind of things. And here we're working on the port side. As I was putting the base coat on here, I was quite pleased, actually. My brake lines are not so noticeable once you get that coat of paint on there. Actually, the work I did to get it flush again came out pretty good. Some areas are not 100% there, so I may do some weathering to kind of fudge it and make it disappear altogether. But overall, I'm kind of surprised I did so well. And now we're doing the wings. Here's the starboard wing. Ran out of paint here, so I had to fill up again. Ran out again. Not putting enough paint in my hopper. I put the wings on and I'm quite displeased. There's a very large gap on the underside of the right wing, which means I'm going to have to put more putty in and more sanding. So I've taped it off since it's a straight line, and hopefully it'll cut down on my work. But that means I'm going to have to sand and repaint down here. I'm resanding here along the lines. Unfortunately, I didn't let it cure long enough, and this is the first pass. I'm actually going to have to do it a second time. Here it looks pretty even and nice and clean, but it's actually a little raised above the surface. And in other areas, it kind of shrank down into the crevice. So again, I'm going to have to redo this and repaint it. On the actual aircraft, there is a line between the wing and the main fuselage, but not this wide. I thought this was going to be a good idea, but it's taking a little longer and a little more work than I thought it was going to be. I put the decal sheet under glass, and I'm using a microscope slide as a straight edge to cut out dimensions for here the air refuel distance markers, and I'm also going to do the no step lines along the wings and the back of the jet rather than use the decals. And here's a little more progress on those distance markers, and here's the wings all laid out. And towards the back there. The wing broke again while I was putting the tape on, so for the fourth time I'm putting putty in there. Right, so I've really covered the model up here just to do those no step lines and the air refuel markings. And just going along the leading edge and the trailing edge of the wing. And here's sort of the reveal. I'm taking off the tape and the paper. The lines came out nice and straight. This, to me, a masking tape, the yellow portion, actually works pretty good. It's pretty flexible and it's easy to work with. It's thin and easy to cut. I didn't have any bleed through at all, so that was a nice surprise. I just have to rely on my skills laying it out in a straight line. Unfortunately, the putty is not working for me on this seam line, so I've taken the left wing off. I did try candle wax in the gap, but that didn't work very well either. So I'm going to rely on an old trick. People use metal foil tape to make canopy frames on their models. So I thought, since this is an actual panel on the wing root, I would just make a larger panel with a piece of tape and then paint over it. And this actually covers up the seam line very nicely. I wish I thought of it in the first place. So I just paint over it and it becomes an aircraft panel. Okay, I've taped off the main gear bay and I've begun to paint it white. We're almost there before I put a gloss coat over the model to do my final weathering, such as oil streaks, panel enhancement, and chipped paint. And while I'm painting this, I'm trying to get every nook here before I put on the intake so I don't have to go in there and mess with it. This is just some quick shots of me gloss coating the aircraft. I did 2 coats on the top and bottom about 30 minutes apart. I'll just help seal the model before I do the weathering. To do my panel outlines, I've chosen oil-based paint with mineral spirits to dilute it. I'll start on the bottom. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the right mix with my wash, so it didn't really have any capillary action that I was expecting due to the dilution and the gloss coat. So I had to help it along here. Luckily, it's oil-based, so it's pretty forgiving, and I can use a Q-tip to adjust and clean up my panel lines here without any problems. After I let the wash set a little, I clean along the leading edge flap. I go at an angle to keep the oil and wash within the recesses of each of these panels so that it doesn't come out. You can see I have little marks around the edges of the panels where I applied the wash, but as you can see, it comes off easily with a Q-tip. You can apply different pressures depending on how dark you want the background. And going to the top, here I've begun working on the panel lines up along the hump. And to kind of demonstrate what I'm doing here, I've picked 2 fuel cell panels here. I've already applied the oil wash within the recesses, and now I'm going to clean it up here. As you can see, I go at an angle, and you can see the results here after I've cleaned up several different panels. And it's nice, at least kind of if you want it, if you don't apply too much pressure, you can leave different amounts of wash, which is really very much like an F-16 outer skin, because you have the fuel leaks and the hydraulic fluid leaks and other types of maintenance grease. I can hardly wait to put the dull coat back on this plane because it looks funny shiny. Now I'm applying bits of silver paint to simulate chipped paint on screw heads, bolts, and panels. To simulate grease streaks from the leading edge flap rotary actuators, I'm just applying a little black paint here. And to help it along, I use my finger to kind of extend it out and kind of feather it out. For the paint chipping on the front edges of the wings, I'm using foam dipped in silver paint. It's a really good technique. The more irregular the foam surface, the better realism you get out of it. And before I apply the foam to the model, I dab it on paper or paper towel, so you're almost like dry brushing, so you don't overpower with unrealistic chip effects. And to simulate paint chipping that quite hasn't gotten to the aluminum surface, I've mixed some yellow and little blue paint to make zinc chromate anti-corrosion. And using a foam rubber again, I just apply it along the front edge of the wings. This kit comes with a one-piece canopy, and like the old model, I'm going to cut it in 2 pieces so I can present it as an open cockpit. I don't have a hobby saw, so I just start with an X-Acto knife making a larger indentation. Then I'm going to heat up an old X-Acto knife to cut through the plastic and create 2 sections. Here I'm heating an old knife, and I can cut about 1/8 of an inch each time I heat up the blade, so it'll take a few passes, but it actually works pretty good. And then I'll just sand the edges. Now we have 2 sections which I will sand, and then I will tape it off so I can paint the canopy frame. And after that I will put the names of Colonel Kurth on here with my decal sheet. I have quite a few decals to put on this model, so to save some time I'll just use the tail as a demonstration on how I'm going to go about putting my emblems on the jet. I have my 3 decals ready. I'll make more precision cuts in a moment. This is my microscope slide, which I'll use as a straight edge for cutting closer to them. This is my reference photograph for the application of the decals. I'll use microset to apply my decal and get it in place, and then I'll use microsol to actually solidify it onto the model. I begin by making closer cuts to the decals and reduce the amount of film area it'll occupy on the model. This is the tail number 80527. And then I work on the Air National Guard emblem next, and then of course the scripted Arizona. Next I line up the decal with the model to make sure they're level. Then I apply microsol, which will help float the decal around as you get it into position. Once it dries out, it starts getting difficult to move around, so you can always apply more moisture, either water or the microsol, to keep it movable until you're ready to kind of dry it up and then set it in place. Next I apply microset to set the decal right into the model surface. This is the completed starboard side of the vertical tail, and for a quick comparison we'll look at it with the old model. Looks better, doesn't it? This video is getting long, so I'm going to just cut to the finish of the build, and we'll do a comparison between the new and the old model and see if I've learned anything from the expert modelers on YouTube who have been so kind to share their techniques and tricks to building a better model.